Hello and welcome to 15 Minutes on Australia's Alternative Varieties. So, what is an alternative variety? Sounds like a strange term, but the reality is it just applies to varieties that are not part of the mainstream varieties planted across Australia. And frankly, these things evolve. Varieties that might have been considered alternative 20, 30 years ago are now actually part of the mainstream. That tends to be how it flows. So we're going to look at a brief history of alternative varieties, how you introduce these new varieties into Australia. There are quarantines and various things. We'll look at reasons behind the rise of these alternative varieties. And we have an excellent guest speaker today who's been really at the forefront of pushing for these, and a gentleman called Ratcliff from Ricca, Terra farms. And then we'll look at discussing with Ashley the leading alternative varieties now, what's looking really interesting and perhaps what's around the corner. So strangely, we've actually got a really old Dolcetto vineyard in Australia, which would be considered alternative, yet it's been in the ground since 1868. So there's been a history of some old varieties that were planted, but then there was much more of a push towards the classic varieties that we know in Australia now, the French varieties that were originally planted. But in the late 1900s, Viognier really started to take shape in the vineyards in Eden Valley, and also specifically with Yalumbo. And other varieties as well that now would almost be considered mainstream. But in 1985, Coriol in the McLaren Valley, they actually planted Sangiovese, and they've also got all manner of different alternative varieties alongside their Shiraz and Grenache as well. Nowadays, Viognier, Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, they've now become quite common styles. So there's an example of some varieties that were maybe considered alternative in the early days, but they've actually moved into mainstream. And so getting these varieties into the vineyard, it can take years before a new variety flourishes, starting with a quarantine. And we'll ask Ashley about that, because any varieties brought into Australia are not just, can't just bring them in and plant them. They're subject to quarantine and checking. Then you have to figure out, well, is this really this particular region where they're going to be going into? What are the soils like? Is it the suitable climate? Does the particular clone of those varieties, those new varieties, work with the inherent regions of the conditions of the region? And then what does it taste like? Is it interesting once it's in the ground? And that's probably the ultimate test and the ultimate sort of decider as to whether that variety will be successful within that particular region. There's also something that Australia specifically has played around with, and you're seeing this in other countries too, is actually developing brand new wine varieties that are really suited to Australia's growing conditions, things that you've likely never heard of: Sienna, Tarango, Mystique, Rubienne, Tamingo, and Tyrian. We're going to ask Ashley about this because he's a little more connected to this sort of development than I am. And why? Why are we doing this? Why are these varieties thriving in Australia? And believe me, they are thriving. Probably one of the main reasons, and again, we'll delve into this with Ashley, is increasing temperatures, just dry spells. There's just a changing environment in Australia. And certainly when I've spoken to many producers, the idea is that they're looking at a changing environment, and which varieties will do better, hold their natural acidity, do better in a changing environment. And by changing, we mean drier and warmer and maybe more challenging conditions, and seeing if these are better suited. And for sure, that's proving to absolutely be the case. There's also another piece of the puzzle which has always been inherent in Australia, and that is that even without thinking about the long term of certain varieties, Australians love to experiment. There's a lovely, healthy respect for tradition in Australia, but you're always looking around the corner and seeing what else is new, tasting wines from other countries, new varieties, and seeing, well, what could we shape out of that here, and what style can we come up with in our region? And I think that inherent sense of sort of innovation and wanting to kind of have a go, as we say in Australia, I think is an important piece of the puzzle. Some of the varieties that certainly I've seen and thriving, and I'm a real fan of: Fiano, Vermentino, Nerid Avola. Probably have to work around the name of Avola because it is a French town, an Italian town name, so we'll have to probably change that. But Sangiovese, Tempranillo, Touriga Nacional, and there's some really cool Portuguese varieties I know Ashley has in the vineyard, and I hear that there's some Greek varieties sitting in quarantine. Maybe they've been released now, but I'm going to bring on Ashley straight in from the Riverland, beaming in right from his vineyard in the Riverland. Are you there, Ashley?
I am. Here I am.
You're up in the mountains in the Riverland.
I am. There we go. Ski mountain, Mount Blanc.
Awesome. Well, look, you looked at the presentation, though. So I've got a couple of questions for you. How long have you been working? Because when I met you first, you took us up the Riverland. You were working with Oxford Landing, which was some fairly traditional varieties. But you showed us your farm here, which is your own property, which is now your primary focus. How long you've been working with quote unquote alternative varieties? How many, what have you been doing with it?
Look, off the top of my head, I think we sort of started planting around 2005, 2006. That was when we first started. We bought our first vineyard in 2003. So I know we had a couple of years to work out that growing Shiraz and Chardonnay, well, we still grow a lot of that. There was more exciting stuff over the horizon. So that's probably when we started.
And so how many different varieties do you now have in that vineyard?
We have close to 40, 41, I think. We've been planting a few more this year. I say think because it's just one of those things. It continues to evolve. So I know we're over 40 different varieties in the vineyard. Some are, up to a few hundred tons. Some varieties are only 3 tons. So the smaller ones are more of the experimental varieties. Cool. We just want to see how they go.
So now, I mentioned a few things. I was talking about why people are experimenting them, but tell us why you planted these varieties. What was it that made you aim towards these as opposed to the other varieties that were maybe a bit more traditional in the Riverland?
Oh, there's probably a couple of reasons that drove me to planting them. One was I've been very fortunate to travel overseas, in particular southern Italy, so through Apulia and Sicily. There's also a large family up here in Mildura called the Chalmers, Bruce and Jenny, who have been importing a lot of these varieties over the years. So back many years ago, I got to tour their vineyard up at Euston, and that's where I came across Terra for the first time. And I guess just that I could see that there were some issues with some climate change. There's a lot of talk about climate change, and I had the view that, there's such a long lag with developing vineyards that you got to take a punt and have a go. So we did it. And our view was if it was wrong, we'd still have some interesting varieties. If we were going to experience more problems with climate change, well, then we were in a better position than most. So, and also the market. I was sort of, even though I live in the Barossa, drinking big, rich wines wasn't always my cup of tea. I wanted something lighter. So a lot of the Italian varieties, make lighter sort of style, more more Australian-friendly wines.
That's a really interesting point. And so are you finding, because I did hear one other producer telling me, I think it was about Fiano, but don't quote me, it could have been another variety, but saying not only does it hold its acidity, hold its freshness in the changing environment, it actually required less water in the vineyard, which I thought was interesting. Are you finding that with some of the varieties?
Yes. Look, if you look at Nerod as a prime example, it's quite a vigorous variety. It's a vigorous. So like we don't want these big vigorous sort of overproducing vines. So the only way to manage that in a lot of ways is to cut water back and cut fertilizer back. So that's what we do. So some of these varieties do suit the region quite well. They all need irrigation. I mean, look. We've had as low as 90 mils in a whole year here. So it's a desert and you do need to put water on. But because we're focusing on quality, some of these varieties are naturally very vigorous. And we do use drought-tolerant rootstocks as well. The combination of those three allow us to irrigate a lot less. I definitely worked with Sienna when I was at Yalumba. I thought it was part of, they had a range called the Innovation Range. And I really liked that variety. It worked really well. And the other varieties I haven't had as much to do with, but I know the CSIRO had a bit to do with a lot of the researchers there. They've got a plethora of new varieties coming in, and some of them are amazing in regards to the colour or the tannins that they can add into wine styles. I think there's a little bit of way to go in regards to getting them out to the market because they are very unknown to the market. But I think like alternative varieties have taken their time. So I think there's a future for them. And a lot of them, they're Australian bred. So, it's something that we can hang our hat on.
Yeah, that's true. And I think as it comes to selling them, while people might go, wow, I didn't know Fiano was in Australia, they'll still go, oh, I've heard of Fiano, I'll try that. Whereas Sienna might be a little bit more of a hard push. But I like the idea that it's an Australian original. Now, you've got a lot of Portuguese varieties in the ground. I was hearing from some other producers that there's some Greek varieties, or perhaps you've even got some in the ground. So along those lines, I mean, you've got 40 different varieties. Are there ones that you're trialing, and on top of that question, which are they? There must be some varieties that are kind of rising above the others, and you're going, wow, actually, these are doing really well.
Well, the Portuguese varieties, we've got a vineyard called it's called Caravel, and we have a brand called Terra del Rio, which means land of river. So it's purely a Portuguese-driven brand. And we have a number of, we have Arinto, which is probably the white variety that's really taking off for us. It holds its acid really well. Great flavours. We've got Zilzi and also Shaw and Smith making fruit from our vineyard from Arinto. Albarino, I've got that planted. In regards to reds, there's Tinta Cow, Tinta Caiada. We've got Tinta Amarella, Touriga Nacional, Tinta Barocca, and I think there's a Tinta something else there. I can't remember, but they're all very different. There's a lot of tintas, yeah. And it's quite a unique variety to grow. You get them too ripe, they can be a little bit porty, because obviously that's their origin is to make ports. But we're finding that they are definitely bringing a complete new flavour profile to our wines and our brand and to the Riverland.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, yeah, that's great. And Greek varieties, anything, are you seeing anything with the Greek varieties? I think it was Steve Pennell down in McLarenville said there's some Xenomavra and a few things coming through. What are you seeing?
When Acetico is coming from Barry's, I've got a lot of Greek neighbours around me, and I think they'd love to see some Greek varieties, but no, nothing yet. There's not too many of them available to plant, but I think in time, we'd love to put some Greek varieties in.
Well, that's awesome stuff. Thanks very much, mate. Really appreciate your time here. I think it's a really exciting development in Australia, and I'm seeing your wines over here, even in places like I live in the Midwest, and I'm seeing them, and it's super exciting. And like you say, the consumers are quite excited about it as well, trying something a little different from Australia. So I think it's a really, really exciting time. And look at you with over 40 of them in the vineyard. Good stuff, mate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a great day. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Ashley.